Hey, we're live. Yes, good. We're going. It's happening. Hello, everybody. All right. Let's make sure all the sound is working. Let me know if you can hear me. Say hey in the chat. And hopefully everything's working. Hey, how's it going, Careful Poet? Glad you're here. Hi, Kaylin. Good to see you again. Yay, good. I'm glad. I'm glad everything's working. Sweet. I'm still trying in this new space to figure out like where the most scenic place is, and today I've decided the most scenic place for you to look at is these closed blinds. So I hope that's okay. I'm still working on it. At some point, I've got to get like an official background to make these videos look a little bit more profesh. But for now, this will work. Sorry, I scared you. That's funny. Yeah, if you have this page on in the background and then I just suddenly start talking, that might be a little bit stressful. So sorry for anyone I stressed out unintentionally. Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else I have to get started before we get going? I think we're good. I'm all plugged in. We may have fewer folks at our little meeting tonight for two reasons. One of them is I changed the time on y'all. I put it on social media, but if you didn't see it there, because we were supposed to have our meeting, our Bible study at the afternoon time. This was supposed to be one of the afternoon versions. However, I had a training today that went all day. That was really good. It was all about trauma and resilience, and it was a really amazing training, but it did go all afternoon. And so I had to move our Bible study to the evening. So that's one reason that we might see fewer people tonight. The other reason, of course, is that if you're in the US, you might be watching the Democratic candidate debate tonight. So that's definitely an option too. I have been reading the transcripts of the debate after the fact rather than watching them because they freak me out. They stress me out. So I just read the transcripts later and then I don't have to deal with watching for so long and letting things freak me out. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you've chosen to join. Hi, Conrad. Glad you're here. Yeah, that's the deal. So we might have fewer people tonight, but I hope we'll still be able to have a good, lively conversation. This is a classic parable that we are talking about, Chef's Kiss parable that we're talking about tonight. So hopefully we will all get lots going on. Hi, Rachel. Yay. Okay, yeah, Rachel, we're going to talk about scheduling stuff later. So I'm glad that you also find this to be a good time. Hold on. I got to pronounce this name. Basilisa? Let me know how you pronounce your name, friend. I'm really glad you're here too, and I want to say your name right. Oh, yes, and good to see you, Conrad. Or, your name at least. So, yes, tonight we are talking about the parable of the prodigal son. Hold on. I'm going to get this name. Oh, Bazzy. Okay, cool. Sorry that I didn't get your full name and notice who you were right away. Good to see you, Bazzy. I'm glad you're here. Cool. So yes, we're talking about the parable of the prodigal son tonight. And this came about for a couple of reasons. I like to give you my background on my train of thought here. As I mentioned last time, we had a Bible study, which was 2 weeks ago. I mentioned that I'm reading a lot of Henri Nouwen recently. I'm reading this. I just actually finished this book, his book Seeds of Hope, which is actually a compilation of a bunch of stuff that he's written. So it's like a good inroad if you've not read any of his stuff before. But Henri Nouwen was a priest who died in the did he die in the late 90s or the early 2000s? I'm trying to remember what year he died. But his work is really, really cool, and I've really enjoyed reading it. But one of the things that he talks about a lot is the parable of the prodigal son. It was something that meant a lot to him. And so as I was reading this, I was like, oh, what are we going to do for our Bible study? And as I was reading this, I was like, you know what? This parable has a lot to say about identity and about community, two things that we talk a lot about in LGBT Christian spaces and trans Christian spaces. We talk a lot about identity and community. And so I thought, perfect, this will be a great parable for us to have a look at. It's probably right up there with the Good Samaritan. It's probably, I think, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son are probably Jesus's two most famous parables. So yeah, that people have written a lot of stuff about this story over the years. So we're obviously not going to be able to go into everything there is to say about this passage, but I hope we'll be able to get into some of it at least. So, preamble over. Let's talk about this passage. So Luke 15 is where you can find this parable, Luke chapter 15. And we should just get some context on Luke 15 in general before we really get into this specific parable, because Luke 15, the chapter itself, has 3 parables in it, all saying basically the same thing. Jesus is saying the same thing 3 different ways. So we should get some context on that. Hey, Raphael, good to see you, meet you. I'm glad you're here too. Yay. Everybody say hi. So Luke chapter 15, we've got this background, right, of 3 different stories. So let's take a look. Luke 15, I am reading out of the NRSV translation, but you can read out of any translation you want. Most of you know this by now, that you can pick a translation and then we can look at similarities and differences, because that's one thing that can help us understand more about the original text, is by looking at how different people have translated the original text into English. So Luke chapter 15, the very beginning of the chapter says, "Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them.' So Jesus told them this parable." And that's how we get into these 3 parables. That's the beginning of the chapter. So essentially, Jesus is sitting with with basically the religious leaders of the day, and they're pissed at him for being in company with sinners. And so Jesus tells 3 parables to kind of explain why he's eating with and in company with and friends with these people that are considered sinners. So the first story that Jesus tells is a classic. He tells them the parable of the lost sheep. Actually, these are so short, I'm just going to read them. We're not going to talk a bunch about them, but they're so short that I think it's just worthwhile reading them. So he starts here in verse 3, and he says, "Jesus told them this parable. Which of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost.' Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance." So that's our first story of lost and found, is a classic one. Jesus tells a lot of parables and stories about sheep because there were a lot of shepherds in his time. And so this is one of the sheep parables that kind of gets mixed up with all the other stories about sheep, but it's specific to this sort of trinity of parables. Careful Poet says, "I've always loved verse 7. Yeah, it is a good verse. That is a good verse. If you've ever been, okay, so this is the thing. I said we weren't going to talk a lot about these first 2 parables, but just a couple of things, since we might as well, right? If you've ever been told, I've heard that this is a thing, and I have heard it myself and then had to go look it up. If you've ever heard a thing from a pastor who has preached on this text, who has said that when shepherds would go get lost sheep, they would break the sheep's legs and then carry the sheep back, and that's why the shepherd in the story is carrying the sheep. That's not true. The shepherds did not do that. There's this terrible urban legend around shepherds doing this to teach the sheep a lesson or to not let them run away anymore. And oh no, Careful Poet, I am sorry. It's not true. Shepherds did not do that. I know that it makes sense if you're oh yeah, the shepherd wouldn't want the sheep to run away again, so break the sheep's legs, then the sheep can't run away, and it's supposed to demonstrate our dependence on God, or God's sort of angry, you won't do that again kind of thing. It doesn't happen like that. Shepherds do not break the sheep's legs. Don't. Ugh, it's messed up. Yes, it's messed up. Not a thing. However, if you do have a singular sheep, and you could try, especially if it's a young sheep, I know a little bit about sheep because I worked on several sheep farms while I was in New Zealand, studying abroad in New Zealand. So I know a little bit about sheep, not a ton, but some. if you have a young sheep, it is way faster to pick a sheep up and carry it than it is to try to get the sheep to come with you. Even if you've like tied a rope around its neck, like you're gonna have a hard time pulling that sheep where you want it to go. So it's way easier to just pick the sheep up, and it's easier. Like if you've seen, there are lots of different ways to carry things, but one good one is sort of around your shoulders, kind of with both legs on either side, because it keeps the sheep from kicking. So, anyways, there are good reasons to pick up the sheep and carry it, but not necessarily breaking its legs. So please don't buy into that urban legend because it's not true. So we've got the parable of the lost sheep, right? That's parable number one. The second parable that Jesus tells about lost and found things is about the woman with the coins. And one of the reasons that I love Luke 15 is because we get kind of three different examples of lost and found, three different stories. And one of them is a shepherd and sheep. And the shepherd in the story sort of uses male pronouns, but there's not as much gender around that first story. And then the second story is about a woman with a lost coin. And the third one is about father and sons. And so I like that there's a little bit of mix of gender imagery going on here. It's not just all men all the time. So Luke 15 is cool like that. Anyway, let's read the second parable that Jesus tells in Luke 15. So the second one starts in verse 8. Jesus says, "What woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost.' Just so, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." So you've got the second story, right, about a woman who loses these coins and then finds one, like searches and searches and searches and then finds it again, right? So again, another lost and found story. So those are the two stories leading up to the story of the prodigal son, which is the longest story in the chapter. But it feels good to just sort of have some background on like what Jesus is trying to say here about things being lost and then found again. So we'll talk about that larger overarching bit towards the end here. But yeah, that's the background. Does anybody have anything to say about these sort of first two parables or background here before we get into the meat of the text that we're going to be looking at? Anything that you notice or love or want to bring up or have questions about? Not that I can guarantee answers, but you never know. Let me know. Rachel says, "I want to work with sheep in New Zealand too." It was really fun. I had a really good, well, okay. It was fun most of the time. Sometimes it was gross and awful and terrible, but most of the time it was awesome. Yeah. Anything else before we go on? Last call. Okay, I'm going to move on. If I see anything because of the lag, we'll take a detour back. Oh, wait, here we go. Careful Poet says, "I think it's good to note the focus of the first two is on the people searching. I have always disliked how much people focus on the lost son's sin." Yeah, so yes, I have some feelings about that too. And I want to circle back to that and how these three stories are different from each other and what's similar about them towards the end after we've kind of looked at all three. But let's circle back on that. Put a pin in it. Bassi notes the rejoicing. Yes, there's rejoicing is it both of these stories? Right? Yeah. Rejoice with me. Rejoice with me. Both times. It's the same thing that they start their like, hey, something good has happened. I love that. I read a Tim Keller book forever ago about the older brother. Oh, why does that name sound familiar? I feel like I know who that is and I can't remember who it is. Remind me who that is, Conrad. Rachel says, "I was wondering what texts or papers did you reference about the shepherd not breaking legs so I can refer pastors who preach on those?" Good question. Where can I, because I can't look it up like as we're doing this, but I will look it up and I will put it in the Discord, Rachel, because I'm trying to remember like the sources that I have on this because I have them stored away someplace. So I have to find them, put them in the Discord. Some evangelical dude. All right, cool, Conrad. Cool. Thanks for the feedback, y'all. I love that what you picked out there. And yeah, we're gonna come back to what you're saying, Careful Poet. So let's jump into the prodigal son, the meat of this text, the big chunk that we're gonna read through. Let's see. Let's read through. Let's read from verse 11 to verse 24. Oh, hang on. I want to break this up into a couple chunks so that we can stop and talk about things. Um, no, yeah, let's read verses 11 through 24. Let's do that. Um, mm, mm, mm. Oh, right. Okay. Now I see. I remember who that is now. Thank you for all the background. Cool. So Luke 15, verses 11 through 24. Let's do this. Then Jesus said, there was a man who had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. So, what are the first things that you notice about that first part of the story? We'll get into the second part in a minute. What do you notice about that first part of the story? What jumps out to you? And if you are a person like me who has heard this passage preached a bajillion times, what have you heard about this passage? What do people tend to pick out and focus on, or what interesting tidbits come up? Rachel points out pigs ain't kosher. Very true. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is, because Jesus is telling the story within a Jewish context, the idea is that the son has gone to another land not filled with Jewish people, because Jewish people don't keep pigs. So the idea of a Jewish guy taking care of pigs is meant to illustrate just how far outside of his own context he is, how far he's gone, and how far he's fallen in terms of like his honor and his identity, right? Yeah. Careful Poet points out the father lets him go and doesn't try to stop him. Yeah. So one of the interesting things about this passage is, because of the way that inheritance worked, basically your inheritance is what you get after usually your parents die, right? Like they die and they leave things to you. That's your inheritance. Within the system that this parable is being told in, if you've got two sons, then your inheritance is split up, but it's not split up evenly because one son is older, right? So the older son gets 2/3 of all of what the father has, and the younger son gets 1/3. That's how it's split up. So when the son says, I want to get the wording right. The son says, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. Basically, when the son is saying, give me this property, he's basically saying, I wish you were dead so I could have your stuff. Like he's like wishing that his father was already passed away so that he could have the little bit of inheritance that he was going to get. And yet the father doesn't stop him. The father's like, okay. And just imagining like how much that would hurt to have your kid say to you, like, hey, I don't care about you, just give me what I want. And then to have the father respond in such a kind way, that's like big, right? Yeah, hold on. I gotta go back to this. Yeah. Okay, I want to go to what Conrad says here. Conrad says he intends to make it up to his father and is sure he will have to work for it to get back into his circle, but his dad is ignoring that and stoked to have him back. The son feels low about himself and wants to lower himself. The father feels highly of him and wants to treat him well. It makes me think of a lot of friends who think the worse they feel about themselves, the more God loves them. shows that isn't the thing to do. Yeah. So a couple things that you brought up there. The first thing is the way that the son expects that he's going to have to work his way back into the father's favor, right? And I love that we've got the son saying, like, this is what I'm going to say when I get home. So we get like this script that's already written, right? The son says, I will get up and go to my father. I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. So we get this like script, like the son says, this is what I'm going to say. And then when he actually gets back to his father, he says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And he doesn't even get to the third thing. Like, he doesn't get to the third part of his script. Before he can even get to that third part, we've got the father just busting in and being like, hey, it's cool. And not like, not cool exactly. That's not quite what I mean. But he basically says, like, before the son can even say anything worse about himself, before the son can even say, I'm going to do my best to prove it to you, the father's like, no, you're already back in. Yeah, so that movement of just like cutting somebody off when they're basically trying to, one, lower themselves, and two, say that they're going to do something to work to prove how much they've changed. The fact that the father cuts him off before he can say that is kind of interesting. Like you said, Conrad, when we think about how a lot of folks, including a lot of us probably, get to the point where we're like, oh man, I really screwed up and I need to work really, really hard to prove that I've changed, or I need to work really, really hard to prove that I'm not a bad person. And the father doesn't seem to require that proof. Like, not to say that throughout the rest of the Gospels, Jesus isn't asking people to change. Jesus does ask people to change and do better. But it's not, the love of the father is not dependent on the things that the son does. The love of the father is dependent on the fact that his son is his son, right? Who he is, his identity. That's what the love is based on, not what the son can do for the father. So yeah. Let's see, what else were we saying in here? Bazzi says, for the father, that must suck that your kid would say that, but he doesn't take it personally. Yeah, exactly. It's the it almost reminds me of a parental response to like a young kid or a kid that doesn't know any better. Like, clearly the kid in this story is old enough to know better. Like, he's an adult pretty much at this point, right? But it almost reminds me of the way that parents have to respond to like their little kids when their little kids say something really hurtful. Like, so, like, little kids will sometimes get into this thing where they like, have you ever heard a little kid tell their parent that they hate them, to be like, I hate you, mom, I hate you, dad? Like, it's, the parent knows better. The parent knows, like, you're saying this and you're super upset, but like the parent knows, not like cognitively knows not to take it personally, even though it might still hurt, right? And it kind of reminds me of this idea that the father doesn't take it personally, and it's kind of like, I know something's going on with you, but like, I still love you. So yeah, it's funny that it seems more like the kind of thing that you would do to a kid that doesn't really know any better. Careful Poet says the son was clearly forgiven before he even got back. Yeah, the fact that we've got, so let's see, in verse 20, it says, he set off and went to his father. While he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. The idea that like the father is just looking, just like waiting. Like, it wasn't like the kid shows up to the gate of the house and is like, hey, I'm back. Like, the father was looking. Like, yeah, that forgiveness had already been given before the son even showed up again. Hold on a sec. I want to look at what Rachel's saying here. Rachel says, someone argued against substitutional atonement with the parable of the prodigal son, saying that if sacrifice was necessary, then the parable wouldn't work. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of true, that if the son had showed up and the father required that the son work like one of the hired hands, I mean, I think we would read it and be like, well, that's fair, but it wouldn't be the parable that it is, right? And especially with the two parables previous, because the shepherd in the first parable does not require that the sheep do anything to prove that it wants to be back with the flock, and the woman with the lost coin does not require that the coin does anything, right? In all of the cases here, it's the shepherd and the woman with the coin and the father that are like, they're not requiring anything of the found thing. They're just happy to have found the found thing. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Okay. So Careful Poet says the sonship was never revoked. And then Conrad says, but the father says his son was dead. So how would that mesh with the idea that the sonship was never revoked? And then Careful Poet says, I think it's like he lost him, but he was still his son. Just because he was gone doesn't mean the father stopped thinking of him. Yeah, I think what I get from this, with this, like combined with that idea of like the son being in a far off land and feeding pigs, like being so far away from his own context, what I get from this is that basically the son took all his stuff and left. And in this day and age, especially among people that most people couldn't write letters, right? There was no way for their father to know if the son was dead or alive. And I think the idea is like he was gone so long and he was so far away that the assumption was just, I'm never going to see my son again. Like my son must be dead. Um, and I think that might be what's going on here, where it's like you just have to assume that about somebody after they're gone for a certain amount of time and you don't hear from them, right? And so when the son comes back, it's almost like the son really has come back from the dead because you've assumed that they're completely lost, right? So that's kind of, I think you're right, Careful Poet, with that idea of like the father still had the love for his son. He was still out there looking for his son and still had a little bit of hope, even though he thought maybe his son was just gone forever, right? Yeah. Let's see. Was there anything else that we wanted to, or that I wanted to, pull out about this passage? Let me know if there's anything else that you want to talk about or look at. Let's see. Oh, one thing that two things actually that are good to point out about this passage. And again, if you've heard a lot of sermons on this passage, you'll probably have heard both of these things before. But for people that might not have, one thing is the word prodigal that we use for this passage, the prodigal son. Prodigal is a word that only shows up in one piece of this text. The idea is to be a prodigal is somebody who is wasteful. Basically, the word means wasteful. So the idea here is in verse 13, or in the NRSV, it says he squandered his property in dissolute living. That's being a prodigal, to be wasteful and just like throwing your stuff away, basically. So that's why we get the name of this passage. And it's kind of funny because when people say prodigal son now, you think prodigal as meaning like the person who returns. When somebody is like, oh, the prodigal returns, like that's kind of what we think of. But really, prodigal means somebody who is just sort of like wasteful. And yeah, Conrad says that their translation says reckless. Yeah, and that's the same thing, sort of like recklessly squandering. That's what that word means. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is the action that the father takes when he sees his son. So in verse 20, it says, he set off, went to his father. While he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. This always gets pointed out in times when I've heard this text preached, is the idea that an adult man running in this time and place was not a thing that you did. It was the idea of like, being overcome with emotion and running in an undignified way. It was undignified is what it was. Because if you're wearing like a long robe, you have to sort of pick your robe up a bit so that you don't trip over it while you run. So my Hebrew teacher used to pair this text with the text. Do you remember the story of Elijah, when Elijah, way back in the Old Testament, when Elijah is supposed to, there's supposed to be a big storm. And so Elijah goes to look out over the sea and he sees a tiny cloud and he's like, oh, that can't possibly be the storm. And the cloud gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's this huge storm. And God tells Elijah to run ahead run ahead of the storm. And so in the Hebrew, it says Elijah girded his loins, which essentially means you take the bottom of your cloak and you sort of like tuck it into your belt. It kind of creates this weird sort of diaper effect, but it gets your cloak out of the way so that you can run without tripping over it. That's where girding your loins, that's where that phrase comes from. And so my Hebrew teacher always used to pair it with this text, even though this text is in Greek. The idea is the same, that you have to like pick up your cloak and in sort of an undignified way show more leg than you should be showing, and in order to run, right? And so the idea of God doing a super undignified running thing, associating God with the Father in this story, God or this Father doing this undignified thing because he's just so wrapped up in love and compassion, is such a great image, and I really like it. Careful Poet says that there's a song about this, which I haven't heard, but I love it. Yeah. So those were two things that I just wanted to pull out because they're fun things to notice about the story. So let's finish up the second part of this story, and then I have a bit from the Henri Nouwen book that I want to read about these identities and these people in the story. So let's read Luke 15, verses 25 to the end of the chapter, verse 32. All right. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house... Oh, no, hold on. Let's go back. So they're celebrating in the house, right? So we get the father and the son and people celebrating in the house. That's our context here. Then verse 25 says, now the father's elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, your brother has come and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Then the father said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and has been found. So, what do you notice about this second part of the story? What jumps out to you? Oh, Bazzy, that's so sweet. Bazzy says, I work with people who are addicts and have been separated from family living on the streets. I imagine how parents and family members must feel relief and rejoice that their children are alive. Right, that sense of like being disconnected from a family member and not knowing what's going on with them and then seeing them again, like that's a big thing. It's a big thing. Rachel points out that Conrad too. Same time, you guys. That the brother says, this son of yours, this idea that the brother is like so pissed. And I mean, like that could be one way of reading it. One way of reading it is just like, I'm so angry that I can't even think about this other guy as my brother. He's just this other, your son. It's kind of like, you know, when parents argue about like who has to get up with the baby in the middle of the night, and they're like, oh, it's your kid. Like, I feel like that's kind of the same thing here. But the other way you could read this is the idea that if the older brother also basically considered his younger brother to be dead, he doesn't even want to acknowledge that his younger brother has sort of come back to life. As far as he's concerned, his real brother died the minute he requested that inheritance, right? And so he almost like isn't ready to see this brother who's come back as his real brother again, right? Careful Poet points out the forgiveness given to the lost son does not diminish the love for the one who stayed. And that's really the crux of the thing, isn't it? That's really like the center of this whole argument, is that the older brother thinks that that's not the way it works. The older brother thinks that love is a finite resource, and if his younger brother gets the love that he doesn't think he deserves, then there's going to be less for the older brother, right? So that's part of what's going on here for sure, and recognizing that that doesn't seem to be the way that it is in the mind of the father, right? Anything else jump out about this second bit of the text? Bazzi says, this is such a real story. Every family experiences this type of sibling rivalry. Yeah, I think that's why this is like one of the most popular of Jesus's parables, is because everybody who has a sibling is like, yep, that's the way it is. I think everybody, and even if you maybe don't have a sibling, but you've got other people in your community that you're close to, this idea of like favoritism, right? We have such a strong sense of like like against favoritism and a strong sense of like what's fair, that when this brother who technically doesn't deserve any of this celebration shows up, the older brother is like, wait a minute, that's not fair, like that's not right, he screwed up, so he shouldn't get the love that I'm getting, I should get the love because I've been doing everything right. I think that this really speaks back to what we were talking about in terms of like works, and substitutionary atonement in terms of like the works that are required. Because the idea here is that, yeah, the older brother is like, he should have to, like, the older brother isn't actually saying he should have to do something. He's saying he shouldn't have done the bad thing in the first place. So like in the older brother's mind, there is no room for redemption for this younger brother at all. Like there's no path forward. It's just like, nope, that guy screwed up and he's dead. He's out of here. He's not part of this family anymore. In the older brother's mind, that's already a decision that's been made. In the younger brother's mind, he's thinking, I've got to do something to prove it. I've got to do something to prove it. And then the father's like, you're both wrong. Which is kind of funny when you think about it. Conrad says, as the oldest brother with brothers who definitely struggle with addictions and such growing up, I felt uncared for when my parents had to focus all of their energy on them. So in a way, relatable. Yeah, I mean, that's oh, and then Conrad also says, at the same time, though, now that my brother has been working hard and getting clean, I do celebrate with my parents. Yeah, so I think, Conrad, you're saying what Bazzi said here about the, like, this is a very real story with, like, people acting the way you would expect them to act. I don't think that it's helpful to point to this story and be like, this person's wrong and this person's right. And because we all have times when we are one of these two brothers, right? When we are the person who says, that person over there is not pulling their weight. And times when we say, oh, I'm not even worthy. Like, I really screwed up and we feel so bad about ourselves. There are times when we feel like one of these two characters. And so I don't think we need to be down on ourselves for acting like one of these two characters sometimes, as long as we recognize it and recognize that it's maybe not the way that we want to be acting, right? Careful Poet says, I feel like that's how God responds to us a lot of the time. Nice try, guys, but that's not how that works. Yeah. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to just pull out of here really quick? What do you all think? I'm interested in what you all think about verse 31, when the father says to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. What do you think the father means by that? Because, yeah, I wonder about what that actually means in the life of the older son and how that's actually worked out. Why does the older son not feel like that's true? I don't know. What do you all think? That's just an interesting thing to ponder. Rachel says, I guess the son never realized he was living in abundance and that he always had to work for his dad. I wonder if it's miscommunication or something. Yeah, I think you might be right about that, not realizing about the abundance thing. Yeah, this idea that the son is like, I've been slaving away for you. And the father's like, you've had everything. Like, it reminds me maybe of, like, I'm not sure this is what's being said here, but it's possible. So what's being said is, I know you feel like you have to work really hard for my love, but my love is there whether you work hard or not. That's kind of the way that I read it. And I don't know, that strikes me in a like very profound way. So I'm not sure if that's true, but I kind of like it. Careful Poet says, the prodigal son lost out on so many years of the father's blessing, and now he gets a party, but it's not going to make up for what was lost. The older son doesn't realize that he has the net gain. the older son didn't lose all those years with the father. Ooh, I like that. I like that idea that, like, basically the father saying, yeah, you've had my blessing the whole time, and he's only had it for a couple of years and then just now. So really, you're the one that got the good deal because you've had the love the whole time. Yeah, that is a great point. I had not thought about it like that before, but I like it. Any other interpretations of maybe what the older brother is thinking, or what the father means when he says that bit about all that is mine is yours? All right. Well, let me know if you have any other thoughts about that, because I'm interested. I think that's a really interesting point to take a look at. Oh, Bazi says the father seems not to have much of a relationship with either of the sons by his son's reaction. Question mark? Yeah, that's and I think that speaks to what Rachel was saying about the miscommunication thing. Like, I wonder if there's kind of a breakdown in communication. You know how, like, there are some folks whose parents don't say "I love you," like it's just not a thing that's said in their family. Um, the It reminds me a little bit of the folks that I've talked to who have had that experience where they're like, "No, my parents tell me that they love me, but not verbally. They tell me that they love me with food. Like, my mom makes amazing food and I get to make food with her, and that is love for us, and she doesn't have to say that for that to be true." I wonder if something like that is going on in this story between the older brother and the father, where it's like the father is trying to give all kinds of love to the son, and it's just not the son's love language. He's just not getting it. um, I kind of wonder if maybe that's what's going on here. Is there's like a weird breakdown in communication, and like, um, ooh, Kalen says, I think the older son hasn't understood his father's nature. Yeah, so there's something about like the fact that the older son rather, is not able, like, there's something blocking him being able to receive what the father is giving, and there's some kind of like breakdown in language or something. Um, and it makes me think about how, I don't know, that for me feels like a really good encapsulation of what the Christian life feels like sometimes. The idea that we are in a relationship with this incredibly gracious and loving God, and yet we feel so unloved. Like, how does that work for us? Like, what breakdown is there in communication where there are times when we're just like, "Ugh, I'm worthless, I'm not lovable, nobody cares." And we've got this person that's trying to give us all this love, but we're not receiving it, or we can't feel it. That to me feels like an incredibly relatable thing. I don't know. Um, hold on. Where are we? I got lost in the chat. I got so excited. Um, oh, Careful Boat says he thinks he's been working for it and never took the time to get to know the father aside from the work. An interesting way of thinking about that. Yeah, the idea that, like, you can essentially think like this is a transactional relationship and not actually get to know the other person at all. And the other person's like, "Hey, I just want to know you as a person." And you're like, "But I'm doing the work." Yeah, also relatable. Um, yeah. Ah, I love this conversation. This is a great conversation. Um, cool. Okay. Well, I want to pivot for a second here because uh, I want to talk about how parables like this can help us understand our position or our experience in community. I talked about this a long time ago. I made one of the Trans and Christian videos on the Good Samaritan, and I can find it and link it someplace. But if you just search Trans and Christian Good Samaritan, you'll find it. I made a video on the Good Samaritan where I talked about how in parables like this, we tend to go, which one am I? Like, we kind of look at all the characters and we're like, oh, which one am I today or right now? Or like, which one's closest to my experience? And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we tend to think like, are we the priest, the Levite, or the Good Samaritan? Those are the three people that go by the hurt man, right? And we tend to think of like, are we one of those people? But very rarely do we go, oh my gosh, what if I'm the hurt guy? Like, what if I'm the guy that got beat up and needs help? And so how it can be helpful to think about like what other people in the story might we identify with that might not jump to mind right away, right? So that's what I was thinking about when I was looking at this parable. I was thinking like, we often connect to the younger son or the older son, right? Those are the two people in the parable that were like, oh yeah, I see my actions there. I see them there. But when I was reading this Henri Nouwen book, he takes a jump and he's like, what if the Christian life is preparing yourself to become the Father? Not to become God, but to become like, to essentially become like Jesus and follow Jesus' example as Jesus is the person searching for the lost things, right? So I'm going to just read this bit from Henri Nouwen. Good. Bazzy's way ahead of us. Bazzy says, I can relate to the father. It's hard trying to raise two kids. Yeah, there you go. So, okay, I want to read this bit here. Actually, there's a couple bits here. He's got a bit about each of the people in this parable and what he's thinking about them. So when he's talking about the younger son, he's talking about the prodigal, right? The younger son who's run away. Nouwen says, real loneliness, so this is while he's still gone, real loneliness comes when we have lost all sense of having things in common. The younger son had become so disconnected from what gives life, his family, his friends, his community, even food, that he realized that death would be the next natural step. The younger son's return takes place in the very moment that he reclaims his sonship, even though he has lost all dignity that belongs to it. In fact, it was the loss of everything that brought him to the bottom line of his identity. He hits the bedrock of his identity. When he found himself desiring to be treated as one of the pigs, he realized that he was not a pig, but a human being, a son of his father. This realization became the basis for his choice to live instead of to die. So what Nouwen's saying about the son is essentially that the son's recognition of his identity in his family, in his community, his humanity, it was that rediscovery of his identity that allowed him to come back and be part of that community again, that allowed him to choose life. And that was really powerful for me when I read that. I was like, oh, wow. Like the idea that you choose or you remember that above all things, you are a beloved child of God. Like above all things, you are a beloved child. That is both above all and also the bedrock of your identity, right? Remembering your identity as a loved child can help remind you who you are and who you are in community. And I found that really helpful when thinking about the younger son. So then when he talks about the older son, he says, the conversion of the elder son is more difficult because the distance to be traveled is an inner distance. There are no flag wavers along the road when he comes around the bend in triumph. The hardest conversion indeed is the conversion of the one who stayed at home, and there are still many elder sons and elder daughters who are lost while still at home. Resentment blocks the perception and experience of life as a gift. So that one is, now it's basically saying what we already know. This idea that like often we hear about this story as the story of the conversion or the return of this son who's done wrong and is coming back. But in a way, it's also the story of what we hope will be a conversion or a change of heart for the elder son too, for the older son, right? So that's Nouwen sort of like elder son thing. So then Nouwen goes on and talks about the father. This is in a part about Nouwen, so there's a little bit of a intro here before it's actually Nouwen's quote. So the book says, Nouwen did not arrive easily at identifying with the father. It became a major point of discussion when he presented it as a difficulty to his friends. He protested, I cannot presume to put myself in the position of the father. Those around him insisted, but you are the father. The son doesn't stay a son forever. The son must grow up and become a father himself. So then Nouwen says, isn't there a subtle pressure in church and society to remain dependent? Who has truly challenged us to liberate ourselves from immature dependencies and to accept the burden of responsible adults? I no longer need to use my sonship to keep people at a distance. Becoming the compassionate father is the ultimate goal of the spiritual life. So there's like this possibility of recognizing yourself as the younger son who is so loved, and recognizing yourself in the older son who is also so loved and can't quite see it, and then recognizing yourself in and what we hope to grow into in the Father as somebody who can give this love in a way that is like so boundless and expansive and ridiculous that like people can't even believe it at first, right? So what do you all think of this idea? What do you all think of these three examples of different identities? Is it helpful to think about ourselves or to think about the Father as a possible thing to grow into? Yeah, Careful Poet connects it and says, love others as we have been loved. Yeah, that's the idea, is to like not just stay the son, but to grow up and be able to give love in that same expansive way. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so Rachel says, I think I'd like to read the book. So this book, Seeds of Hope, is like a bunch of, it's a collection of a bunch of Nouwen's writing. But Nouwen wrote a book specifically on this parable because it meant so much to him. And it's called, hold on, it's called The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henri Nouwen. So that's the book you want to read if you want to read Nouwen's writing specifically about this parable and this idea. So here's the other reason that I wanted to talk about these identities and community, because I think when we talk about being a community, the LGBT community or the trans community or the trans and Christian community, you know, our sort of smaller bubble in the world, I think about the ways that we are in relationship to each other. And like, I think about the way that these three characters are in relationship to each other. And so it's reminded me about some of the, I was going to say, like if any of you, for instance, if any of you watch The Good Place, there's this great line in The Good Place when they're talking about ethics, and the question of ethics being, what do we owe to each other, right? In a society, what do we owe to each other to make this whole thing work? And I kind of think of that question when I think of this story. Not that we owe works or like things that we have to do to prove something, but the idea of the responsibility you have to the people in your family and the people, and when I say family, I don't mean just your bio family. I mean like your chosen family, the people that you live with and spend time with, your close community. What do we owe to each other in terms of our relationships? How might we, in some situations, be the father who can like give love expansively, and that's what our community maybe needs from us in that moment. And in what moments are we the son where we have to say, hey, I did something bad and I really screwed up and I'm sorry, and we have to like come back, right? And in what points are we the older brother who is like, hey, great you're back and all, but like we need to be able to see some change in what's going on. And like there's like strengths to each of these different sort of identities or understandings within a community. And there are definitely weaknesses to both of the sons for sure, but there are strengths to all of them. And I wonder how this sort of parable or metaphor can help us understand how we act with each other. So hang on, I got to go back and read the chat. Careful Poet says, we save their place at the table even if they choose not to take it. Oh, I love that. Or we come back to the table when we mess up and rebuild the relationships lost. Yes, I love this. I love this table metaphor. This is great. Ugh, so wonderful. Yes, this idea that like, yeah, if we are essentially these three people in a relationship at a table, how do we make this work? And I think this parable can tell us a lot about how to make it work. The basis of it seems to be, one, expansive, never-ending, abundant love. Two, remembering your identity as a person who is loved, right? Like those two things seem to be a real basis for a lot of this whole text. Bazzy says, the father reminds them that they are part of the family no matter what. Yeah. Hold on, I got mixed up in what Conrad was saying. Conrad is advocating for tangible love, by which they mean an active compassion, using our gifts to help others, and also acknowledging when you screwed up. Yeah, I think that's the thing when I think about our community and how we can be in community with each other. And I've talked about this before. We've all talked about this before, how easy it is to just say, like, you screwed up and you're out. And how this story is another example of saying, yeah, you can screw up, but that doesn't mean you're out forever. Like, yeah, you screw up, but there are, and of course, there may be occasions when it does have to be a separation for the safety of people in the community. But for the majority of the time, I think this is a good example of saying, like, if somebody comes back and says, I'm sorry, I screwed up and I want to do differently, we can jump in almost even before they're done saying that and be like, yep, you're back in. You're still family, right? And that can be a call for us as a community. Conrad says, God doesn't cancel, folks. Yeah. Careful Poet points out, being willing to let go of pride when it comes to forgiveness. Yeah, exactly. That moment of the father running, sort of like letting go of all of his pride in that moment. Yeah, accepting someone back even if we're angry about it. Yeah. So, like, as always, we have to have sort of some stipulations about, like, making sure that people are safe and making sure that nobody is coming in with a harmful intent. But, like, if somebody is coming in like this prodigal son and coming back and saying, like, I screwed up, I'm really sorry, to be able to let go of our pride in order to go, like, I'm still pissed at you, but, like, I recognize that you're sorry and you want to come back and you want to do differently. And, like, how can we respond to that in a way that is ridiculous and huge and throwing a party, right? So, okay, the last thing that I want to talk about before we go tonight is how all of these three stories connect to each other, all of these three parables. So we talked about the first parable is the parable of the lost sheep. The second parable is the one about the woman with the lost coins. And then the third parable is the one about the prodigal son. These three parables, it's really interesting to sort of line them up next to each other. And I wonder if you have any things that you note about how these parables are different from or similar to each other. Are there things that you notice that are similar or different when we look at these three parables? Bazzi says, pretty much everything Jesus has to teach us is about being in community. Yeah, yeah. Barry says, having tremors typing is slow for me, but I want to thank everyone for this great discussion. Thank you, Barry. I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you for listening and being involved in spirit. I appreciate that. So one thing that I noticed about these three parables and how they all go together is, and I've preached on this before, and I think I might even have posted it someplace, is the difference in the lost thing in each of the three parables. Yes, okay, good. Conrad's leading me right into what I was going to say. Conrad says in the first two, the lost things don't need to try to be found. But in the third one, the son takes initiative to go back, which is different. Yeah, okay. So here's the thing that jumped out to me about these parables. In these three parables, there's a different amount of agency that each of the lost things has. So in the parable of the lost sheep, you've got a sheep who has gotten lost, and it's not said whether the sheep, now I'm going to scroll back up to this parable. Yeah, it's not said whether the sheep is, like, intentionally wandering off or not. The sheep might have just gotten distracted by a butterfly. We're not told, like, what's going on with the sheep or why the sheep got lost. And the sheep also is not taking the initiative to come back. In that case, first of all, the sheep is not intentionally or unintentionally getting out of, like, leaving. And two, God goes and finds that sheep, right? So there's some agency there on the part of the shepherd. The shepherd is the one doing the thing, right? Then in the second parable, you have a woman with the coins. The coins, of course, being inanimate objects, can't intentionally get themselves lost. They can't decide to wander away. So in that story, you've got a object that has absolutely no free will, and God is finding that thing and celebrating over it, right? And then in the third one, you've got the son who does have free will and does have agency and chooses to not only do a harmful thing by hurting his father, by asking for that inheritance, but he also chooses to come back. So there's agency in this third one in the way that there weren't in the first two. And when I think about these three passages, I think about the fact that Jesus is using them all to illustrate being lost, and he is using it in response to the religious leaders asking about sinners, right? So we're supposed to assume that each of these lost things is like a sinner. But it almost seems to me like Jesus is using three different stories to talk about this, because he's saying that there are three different ways to be lost, and not all of them are the lost thing's fault. That's kind of, I don't know, that's the first thing that jumps out at me. Like, when it comes to the coin, it's not the coin's fault that it's lost, right? And when it comes to the prodigal son, it is his fault that he's lost because he made choices, right? When it comes to the sheep, I think the sheep one is honestly the most interesting one, because when you think about sheep and shepherds, and this is something that ancient shepherds would have known, there are times when when a group of sheep will decide that another sheep is no good, and will like kick that sheep out and not let it hang out with them anymore. Like, sheep are weirdly cliquish like that. They'll just be like, I don't like that one. And it's not super usual, but it's not super unusual either. And so when I read that one about the sheep, I think, is this sheep lost because it intentionally wandered off? Is it lost because it just wasn't paying attention? Or is it lost because the other sheep kicked it out, right? And so for me, when I read these three parables, I read them as Jesus giving us three different examples of how somebody can be lost, and how to be lost does not automatically make you a bad person or a sinner, right? There's different levels of agency that seem to be going on here. And so that was the thing that kind of really that jumped out to me about these three parables and how they go together. So I just wanted to share that. Careful Poet says, I think it tells us a lot about God's nature. Sometimes he pursues us and searches, and sometimes if we willfully leave, then God will just wait, always watching and ready, but he won't force us back. Yeah, the movement in the first two parables, where God is like actively searching and gonna bring the thing back, is very different from the father who waits, right? The father who waits for the son to come home and recognizes that the son has free will, right? And so sometimes God acts in one way and sometimes God acts in a different way. But I like that we get a variety of options here. Yeah. Yeah. Kaylin says, God can be there for us in the way we need at that moment in time. Yeah, exactly. So anyways, sometimes I think about, why did Jesus tell three stories when he could have only told one? And so then I have to make sense of all of that. So anyways, that's all that I had for tonight about this parable. But this was such a great discussion, and I really appreciate y'all jumping in with your thoughts and opinions. Conrad says, Jesus is a great stand-up and believes in the rule of three. Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So anyways, I really appreciate y'all being here. Thank you for doing this with me. It was so much fun. If you have ideas or Bible study texts that I haven't covered in the Trans and Christian videos or in any of the Bible studies up to now, and you want me to talk about them, do let me know either on the Discord or in the comments of this video after it posts, because otherwise I'm just going to keep bringing stuff that I'm like, I've been thinking about this, which is fine. But if there's like something that you want to talk about specifically, I'm always happy to take a look at that as well. So announcements before we end tonight. The first one is that next week is our Trans and Christian support group that we do as a video chat. So if you are not already signed up for the Trans and Christian support group, you can do that at bit.ly/Trans Christian Support. And you'll be able to sign up for the support group there. And next week's support group, we made the decision to change all of our support groups to the evening time, and we might do the same thing with these actually, to just have everything always happen in the evening on Wednesdays, just for the ease of everybody knowing when things are happening. But anyway, next week will be August 7th. We'll be meeting for our evening time Trans and Christian support group. So that's the plan. And then the last thing is thank you to all the Patreon patrons that make this video happen and make these Bible studies happen and make the support groups happen. You're amazing. I was just talking to a colleague the other day who works in similar circles, and I was talking about all the stuff that I do with online videos and the Discord and just like a bunch of stuff online. And they were like, so are you like getting paid for any of the time that you spend doing all of this stuff? And I was like, well, not really, except for my Patreon patrons. You all are the ones that are essentially paying for the time that it takes to prep some of this stuff and do this stuff and be in these spots. And I really, really appreciate it because I got a lot on my plate these days. And so I really appreciate the help that you provide in that supportive way. So thank you. That's it, everybody. I think that's everything. So, oh, I guess I should say where the Patreon is. It's patreon.com/Austin Lionheart, just like the YouTube channel. And thanks. I appreciate all of you too for coming and being here. I love these. These are fun. All right, everybody. So next week, Trans Christian Support Group, and then we'll be back again the week after that with another Bible study. Keep an eye out on social media and everywhere else. And we'll see you next time. All right, everybody. Peace.